the students that aren't here yet, that they can will have an opportunity to catch up. So there are four announcements. First of all, for those of you at UIC, which are all the students I see on the screen, I sent you an email just before with 3 more recordings from earlier sessions. If you missed any of them, or if you have a particular interest in a particular topic that one of our new Chicago School authors has presented, you can go back and review them. We're still getting some of them put together, and they'll be put up as fast as we can. We're using a YouTube channel so that other people who are not part of UIC can get access to them. And I wanted to mention that next week, newly defended Dr. Maureen Halperin Palenque is going to be presenting comparative urban politics and why we study, why one author or scholar might study multiple cities instead of just one city at a time, and how that works, both how it works if you study 2 cities in the same country, and how it works if you study cities in different countries. So for a number of you, that's going to be a very interesting topic, and I do recommend you, plan ahead. I will be sending out a journal article that she's written for the reading for next week. If any of you need to, the students need to talk to me afterwards about your paper briefly, I will stay for a few minutes to at least set up appointment times if we don't get time to solve everything. And last of all, I just wanted to remind you on the course syllabus, we have 2 aldermen coming to UIC in the Chicago Future series that is at noon, and that's Scott Walsbach, who is the head of the Finance Committee, that is the most important alderman in governing the city of Chicago, and Alderman Lopez, who represents the 25th ward of which UIC is part. They will be appearing on the 27th of October and the 3rd of November, and I will send you again a link to that other Zoom site in case you want to be present and hear their presentations. So today we're continuing the Modern Mayors of Chicago book, we left off last time with Richard M. Daley and the City of Spectacle, and how Richard M. Daley governed and brought us sort of into the 21st century and the global city. And we're going to continue today with his successor, Rahm Emanuel. And we have with us Carrie Leiterson, who's going to start the presentation, and Daniel Bliss, their co-authors of the chapter on Rahm Emanuel. So Carrie, you can unmute yourself and hold forth.
All right. Well, thanks for having me here. I've been really excited to be part of this project and to be speaking at this class again, and working with all these co-authors. So I wrote a book about Rahm Emanuel called Mayor 1%, Rahm Emanuel and the Rise of Chicago's 99%. So also really looking both at his tenure as a mayor and what that meant for the city, in particular, the kind of grassroots and popular movements and organized labor. And before he became mayor, I'd been working as a journalist and spending a lot of time covering these same issues for at least 15 years. So it was really interesting to see kind of the change and the galvanization that Rahm's campaign and tenure as mayor had on all these intersecting different types of community organizations, labor unions, different movements. So I'll just talk very briefly about some of that context, and then can talk more about any of it later on. Trying to share my screen. So just kind of the moment in time where Rahm was campaigning and then becoming and serving as mayor in Chicago was pretty significant. It was kind of on the heels of a real rise in new class consciousness in the US after the Occupy movement and the financial crisis and the kind of framing of Main Street versus Wall Street. And then also sort of before and during his tenure was the start of this sort of new era of racial reckoning, especially centered around all the viral viral videos of police brutality and police killings of people of color. And the one in Chicago, one of many, but the most prominent, Laquan McDonald, murder by a Chicago police officer that figured really prominently. Even today is actually a significant day to be discussing Rahm Emanuel, since he had his Senate committee confirmation hearing today, and the Laquan McDonald for the nomination as ambassador to Japan, and the Laquan McDonald killing was talked about there. So Rahm, as Mayor 1%, as a lot of people were calling him, was sort of on the wrong side of both of these larger framings. If you define wrong side in terms of how a lot of people, including pundits and just kind of regular people, lower income people, middle income people, were seeing it. He had been an investment banker, a very short, really lucrative stint as an investment banker himself during the middle of his political career, and had been really aligned with high finance and investment interests, as well as the business community more generally, but specifically the finance sector that people really blamed, rightly, for the economic crisis and a lot of the turmoil that people were going through. And then in terms of race, maybe a more complicated framing, but Rahm Emanuel clashed with, especially in terms of his relationship with the Chicago Teachers Union and with other popular movements and labor unions, really alienated a lot of people in Chicago's Black neighborhoods. And that was a complicated relationship that sort of ebbed and flowed during his tenure, but definitely a low point with the revelation that his administration had essentially covered up video and the details of the killing of Laquan McDonald, in particular, making sure that it didn't come out before his re-election race with Chuy Garcia. And just really this larger sense of Chicago as a tale of two cities became more prominent during Rahm's tenure. In large part because of his actions and his demeanor, as a lot of people saw it, and coming at the same time as ongoing loss of population in Black neighborhoods, or Black people leaving the city of Chicago, and the violence in a lot of those neighborhoods just continuing to be epidemic, and what people really saw as lack of investment in lower income neighborhoods and prioritizing of downtown and the North Side, and bringing new people in to bolster this sort of creative class in Chicago at the expense of people who had long lived there, and at the expense of public services and jobs that supported those neighborhoods. And it does kind of raise to me the larger theoretical question of, can a society and a city really serve the most vulnerable residents and the whole bulk of the city at the same time that the corporate sector and the international profile of the city really thrives, especially in a city with stressed finances like Chicago. Is it kind of a zero-sum game where attention and investment one place is at the expense of another place? People definitely feel like that happened during Rahm Emanuel's era. What could he have done better? Just to give a few more specific details, Chicago's mental health movement is a relatively small but very vocal and symbolic movement that had grown up before Rahm took office, but was really a pretty defining feature of his tenure, and has continued to be a force, both this actual group called the Mental Health Movement and a movement around the rights and needs of people with mental health issues more generally. So very quick version, Rahm's inaugural budget closed 6 of the 12 public mental health clinics in Chicago, and people who went to those clinics saw this as a really direct and unnecessary attack on their well-being, and that became kind of a metaphor for larger issues within Rahm's leadership as well. And then his relationship with the Chicago Teachers Union, a big standoff throughout his time as mayor, rising most prominently to the national stage during the strike in 2012 that the teachers were largely seen as winning, in the massive shows of public support for the teachers, literally in the streets and in the polls and other ways. And then the fact that a disproportionate amount of teachers were Black women, so that taps into issues with race and gender as well, that also played out in other ways in terms of people's feelings about Rahm Emanuel. And then the teachers union was then and still is led by a progressive caucus that kind of framed the actual contract issues as part of a larger debate that nationally about healthcare and housing and priorities and who has a voice at the table. So, that sort of Rahm Emanuel nationally, even before he was mayor, had been a prominent figure in, the direction of the Democratic Party and sort of centrism and corporatism versus progressivism. So that kind of played out in his standoffs with the teachers union as well. Of course, the Laquan McDonald killing, I'm sure everyone knows all about, and just continues to be a really defining feature of Rahm's political legacy. And I just wanted to end with another image of, I do think that a big part of Rahm's legacy is also what it meant for popular movements and alliances, and just the way that people in Chicago demanded their rights, demonstrated, collaborated. And it would be actually a pretty interesting kind of case study to look at popular movements in Chicago during Rahm Emanuel's tenure. And then, sort of a similar thing happened nationwide when Donald Trump became president, but yet a very different politician. And Trump also became a foil and in some ways a benefit for Rahm himself. But anyway, I should leave it there and turn it over to Daniel. I can talk more about any of this later if anyone's interested. So thank you.
All right, thanks for that. And let's see if I can make this screen share work. It acts a little oddly sometimes on Mac. And wait a minute, host disabled participant screen sharing. Wait a minute, what am I doing here? Okay, there we go. All right. And oh, it's going to be really awkward and not show me any thumbnails of this. Okay, let's see why I'm having a problem here.
You have it open on your screen.
Yeah, I do. And it's
if you hit share screen on the bottom.
Yeah, I clicked on that and I get Keynote unknown, Safari unknown, Mail unknown. It's
mad at you.
It's very mad at me. If you don't mind, I'm going to do this without slides.
I think that's fine. And also, we have a couple of new people who've joined us from the University of Chicago. So I just wanted to say welcome to them.
Hi.
And we're starting in the middle of a book called Modern Mayors of Chicago. In last week's session, we covered the mayors from Harold Washington to Richard M. Daley. And we're starting this session with the discussion of Rahm Emanuel's period as mayor. We'll finish the presentation of the Rahm Emanuel as mayor, take any clarifying questions or something you didn't understand or don't remember or don't know what it means.
Yeah.
But hold the substantive questions until all of the book chapters and all of the authors have presented. So Daniel, you can go ahead now.
Where'd you go?
That'll be fine. Okay, let me call you back. I'll call you back later. Okay, thanks. All right, my apologies for that. I had to tried to get that sorted out, house emergency. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm of course Carrie Liderson's co-author. I teach political science at Illinois Institute of Technology. And I'm actually one of Dick's former students from graduate school at UIC. I got my PhD there in 2011. And so my job with this chapter was to take a look at some of the economic policies of Rahm Emanuel, and also where he stood with the city's business community, and in some respects where the city stood with him. Now, one thing to bear in mind is Emanuel was very, very popular with the business community in the city. And there are in a number of respects some sound reasons for this. It wasn't just jobs for the boys. there were some clear trends of success. Chicago scored a very high rate of foreign direct investments under Emanuel. If you measure it by the distinct number of projects as opposed to the dollar amount, if you measure it by the distinct number of projects, Chicago led all cities in North America on foreign direct investments throughout Rahm Emanuel's term as mayor. So this wasn't simply a case of him having the right kind of background. There was a heavy dose, I think, of him being a CEO mayor, and it's difficult to get across just how untraditional by Chicago standards Rahm Emanuel's background is. There was never really much in the way of direct involvement with city, ward, or even organization politics. Although if you dig far enough into the video archive of local TV stations, you will find pictures of video of about a 17-year-old Rahm Emanuel down in Marquette Park at about 1978, demonstrating against neo-Nazis. And being just as prickly to the press then as he is now. Now, growth in Chicago in the 2010s did recover, sort of. I wouldn't say hugely dramatically. It still lags other cities to a certain extent, but at least we didn't shrink like we did in the 2000s. Loop jobs went up from around 275,000 to about 340,000. You saw a big increase in CPS graduation rates from the mid 50s to the upper 70s, percentage-wise. For Emanuel's own part, I mean, there was an avoidance there of directly challenging the previous regime, which I'll get into in a moment. But if you take a look at a neighborhood level map, and this is where I really wish I had the slide, but you're going to see uniformly broad population growth. Well, I shouldn't say uniformly, because the loop near north, near south, and near west sides grew much faster than the surrounding areas. But you saw very substantial population increases in the sort of 10 to 20% range on much of the near south side, Hyde Park, Grand Boulevard, Douglas, Oakland. Even some pretty solid gains, close to 10% in Washington Park and Kenwood, and also up on the north side in Lincoln Park and Lakeview, and getting up into Bucktown, getting up through Wicker Park and Bucktown. Farther out, you saw a lot of population declines, particularly Englewood, a huge loss there. But the far south side, the former sort of middle class African-American area that produced aldermen like Eugene Sawyer, for example, who later became mayor, that saw some very big population losses down there. So what was it that was making Rahm Emanuel tick, and what was getting in his way? Chicago's long-term indebtedness is a big issue, 28 billion shortfall on the pension alone, and it's arguable Emanuel was really unable to do much more than triage this. The overall overhang in the city of Chicago and in Illinois, other Illinois municipalities, and the state of Illinois is at a level where it's very difficult to see, given what happened to the income tax referendum last year, very difficult to see how they do this without some major rollbacks at the constitutional level. And even those could be very awkward given contract law in this country. Looking at some specific controversies, Emanuel, as I say, didn't necessarily challenge the Daley leadership directly. He could have, I think he arguably could have put up a bigger fight to the parking meter in court. He chose not to. Issues of racial bias that festered through the Daley era continued to fester under Emanuel, which we've already covered today. And there's a perception, certainly in a large chunk of the public, that questions of economic justice are not being addressed, of which, again, more in a moment. Some progress, I would argue, on Chicago infrastructure, a huge increase in the rate of just basic stuff, such as the rate at which streets are paved. significantly improved transit and other infrastructure, often through projects that came in at or below budget. Particular call out for Kiewit's job on the South Red Line that came in so far below budget that they redirected funds to expand disabled access at various train stations. This was from 2013. But I think there's a broader trend here of a little less attention to ward-based projects. Mayor Daley ran around funding new police stations and new library branches. I think Emmanuel was more concerned about citywide items like transit and like the airports. Let's take a specific look before I wrap up on the question of policy adoption, looking at the North Red Line Main. You start off in 2012 with an emergency fix. They were very close, I think quite close to being shut down by safety authorities on that, given the state of things. And during the summer of 2010, indeed, the roof literally blew off the station at Bryn Mawr. Emmanuel produced about $100 million for station renovations, which was something that Daley had been very reluctant to do directly out of city resources. I've also got this explanation in this chapter just highlighting the role of a particular planner, a policy entrepreneur, if you will, Chrissy Mancini-Nichols at CMAP, who's the one who seems to have originated this suggestion for transit TIF, this idea of a tax increment financing approach that holds schools harmless and that devotes funds to transit, which is something that's clearly associated with higher property values. Emmanuel's connections with Washington helped to prioritize this project, and Chicago and the state of Illinois moved much faster than projects at that time in other states in securing funds, fast enough to get it locked in before the Trump administration took power, while the Caltrain electrification, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, had many anxious months before Elaine Chao finally released the project, the then transport secretary. Looking though at this remaining issue of economic justice, one of the underlying trends of the Emmanuel era that I want to bring up is a sense that the city has not been sufficiently dealing with trends of with questions of economic justice, and accordingly, certain groups in the city, labor unions in particular, broadening their political agenda. The teachers union in particular, the board changes there in 2010 and 2011 produced a new generation of activists like Jesse Charkey, who had simply a broader overall economic and political agenda. And you see this in the result of us now having, for example, 6 Democratic Socialists of America endorsed aldermen on the city council. Conversely, I think you also see it in the increasing politicization of the police union, fighting a culture war in a much more, if you will, pro-Donald Trump alignment. When you take a look at some of Emmanuel's projects, Related Midwest Scheme and the 78, the $2 billion in TIF subsidies passed at Emmanuel's final council meeting with Lori Lightfoot's acquiescence, again, it shows some markers and it shows some trends that are very difficult to shake. At the same time, that emerging split on the city council, which I should warn you, it's nothing like the splits on the city council we've had in past eras, but there has been a very clear increase in the rate of divided roll call votes, and that's a trend that has continued into Lightfoot's administration. So I'll wrap up there for right now.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Any questions just for clarification? Okay, we'll go then next to moving from Emmanuel to Lori Lightfoot, and Marco Rosario Rossi will present our chapter on the Lightfoot administration. Rosario. And Rosario, you're muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have to unmute and then I have to share the screen. So I'm going back and forth. All right, is it visible,
Yes, it
the
is.
shared screen? Okay, great. So this is a chapter that I worked on with Professor Simpson about the Lightfoot administration. It essentially covers the first 2 years of her administration. And what we hypothesize about this chapter is that Lori Lightfoot came to power essentially by focusing on 2 different types of coalition in the city. One is a good government coalition that wanted to deal with the entrenched corruption here in Chicago. The other one is a progressive coalition that wanted to deal with broader issues of wealth distribution in Chicago. Throughout her tenure as mayor, she sort of had to try to balance these coalitions. And her main frictions outside of her trouble with more conservative members on the council and the remembrance of the old Chicago machine is essentially working through these 2 coalitions that continue to pressure her. So understanding the context of this, first, let's go take it back to 2019 with the historic election of Lori Lightfoot. This election in Chicago was described as a political revolution in some circles, maybe a bit of exaggeration, but in any case, it was a dramatic sea turn from the status quo. So Lori Lightfoot, who would never hold any type of public office before, won against Tony Preckwinkle, who was the Cook County president. She won with 74% of the vote and won all 50 Chicago wards. In addition to her winning, 12 new council members were elected, which included 5 socialists, 5 women, 3 African Americans, 5 new Latinos, 2 people who identified as LGBTQ, and then 1 conservative Democrat who originally was an independent and just converted to the Democratic Party right before running for the election. So first, let's talk about the good government aspect of Lightfoot's campaign. There was an editorial produced in Chicago Sun-Times after she was elected from Andy Shaw, who was a member of the Better Government Association, which is a nonprofit organization that Lightfoot used to be on the board of, that laid out sort of these 6 aspects that he thought Lightfoot should work to change the Chicago government to root out corruption. I've highlighted 3 aspects of them, or 3 of them, and these are the ones that we have seen some type of movement on, some type of changes on the city council. So they have had evaluations of the program to try to look at efficiency and eliminate duplication waste. She's done that in the series of budgets. They have banned secondary employments, and they have curbed, but not totally eliminated, all alderman prerogative, all right? Other aspects: impose term limits, fold the city treasurer and the city clerk position, extend the authority of inspector general, reduce the size of the city council. None of those, there's been no movement, none of those things have been changed. And some of them, there is likely to be intense resistance for. And even other ones like the inspector general, a lot of you probably heard from Inspector General Joe Ferguson. He's retiring, and he's actually had some tensions with Lightfoot during her campaign. Now, a lot of these were inspired because of the fallout from the Ed Burke scandal. Ed Burke is the longest serving alder on the council and was the chair of the finance committee. In late 2019, his office was raided by the FBI. The accusation that led to this raid and the indictment that's saying that Ed Burke basically used alderman prerogative, his ability to issue permits in his ward to extort a local business, which was a Burger King, to let his law firm do for property taxes and a contrary contribution to Tony Preckwinkle. Now, included this is that a lot of the information came out because Danny Solis, who was an alder of the 25th Ward, was wearing a wire and recorded several conversations with alders in the city council. Now let's turn to the progressive aspect of it. So after Lightfoot, shortly after she was elected, there was a report card given to her by a bunch of progressive organizations about things she's done. I highlighted things that have occurred during administration. The green thing is not something she has done, but the state actually has taken some action on. The other one that is sort of in that aspect is support for an elected school board. Lightfoot ran on that. Then she kind of reneged after tensions she developed with the teachers union, very similar to the tensions that Rahm Emanuel had with her. But the state government has moved on creating an elected school board here in Chicago. Things that they give her incomplete on, that there hasn't been movement, is the shuttering of the mental health clinics and establishing an Office of Gun Violence Prevention. So one of the major issues that's tied with the Office of Gun Violence is crime and policing in Chicago that her progressive coalition is really pressured on. Lightfoot did have a reputation as as an advocate of police accountability because she was a president of a police reform board here in Chicago. There was two groups, the GABA, the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, and the Chicago Alliance for Racism and Political Oppression. They really worked to have two different models of police accountability. They eventually coalesced on one model, and Lightfoot initially was opposed to it. However, through the support they gained on the council and labor unions and other progressive activists, they were able to move her, but there was a compromises where some of the community control they wanted of police department was removed from the bill. A common issue that Lightfoot has had with progressives throughout this is mayoral control, where Lightfoot is very protective of maintaining mayoral control, and a lot of the progressives want to distribute power to different areas of the city. Now, in the context of police accountability is the issue of crime, which has really hurt Lightfoot politically recently. The last 2 years have been very violent years for Chicago, over 500 homicides in 2019 and 775 in 2020. A lot of this is in the context of COVID and the panic buying of guns that occurred. There was a poll taken in August of 2020, but pretty recently, that showed that crime was the major concern of Chicagoans by a large margin. 44% of Chicagoans said it was a major crime. Next is COVID, which was only 12%, education, schools, healthcare, and police reform. So dealing with this issue of crime within a progressive framework has really sort of encapsulated some of these broader issues that Lightfoot faces, because even though the progressives really want to have a lot of police accountability, there are some people push back and says that we can't hamstrung our police too much, such as advocating for defunding or abolish them because they have to deal with the high crime rate in Chicago. The main battleground that Lightfoot has fought, though, with the progressives have to do with the budget. And so we have two to analyze so far, and a third one coming up. So in the 2020 budget, Lightfoot was facing a huge budget gap that she had to fill. So $838 million. She did offer $11 billion plus budget, which had new taxes on ride sharing, new parking meters, doubled the tax on food and drink, created a real estate transfer tax, created revenue from legalizing vices, particularly marijuana, and there's talk of the casino, declaring a TIF surplus, which
Tony, turn off your, thank you. Go ahead, Rosaire.
Which no mayor had declared a TIF surplus to the degree than which she had, but a lot of progressives wanted to do it more, which declared a surplus of 300 million, and then use some of the money, still had some money to fund marginally some homelessness, community-based outreach workers, and mental health. The 2021 budget also was a huge shortfall, near $1 billion because of COVID. She introduced a $12.8 billion budget, had to lay off 350 non-union employees and eliminate 1,000 positions, had to refinance $500 million of debt, which in the short term is good for the city, but in the long term could really hurt it. Had to raise fines and fees, which she ran against as a candidate. She also raised property taxes, which was very unpopular, though it was a marginal raise, mostly because it tied property taxes to consumer price index, so they go up each year. And they still had some money to fund for mental health workers, partnering with police to try to have some alternative police program to deal with, again, this issue of police accountability. Now, this slide is sort of a breakdown of the two budgets. You can find in the 2020 budget, there was considerable opposition. And in the 2021 annual budget, there was even more opposition. The divide on the 29-20 votes are pretty symbolic because that was a similar divide that happened during Harold Washington's time, except the 29 votes were against the mayor, whereas this time they're for the mayor, but still nonetheless very divided votes. Now, part of the divisions that occurred is because even though Chicago is a city that's dominated by Democrats, we have seen the city council sort of break down into these caucuses and these different voting blocks. Currently, there are 3 identity caucuses in the Chicago City Council. So it's the Aldermanic Black Caucus, Latino Caucus, and LGBTQ Caucus. Then there's 2 ideological caucuses, the Progressive Caucus and the Socialist Caucus. And then within those caucuses, there's two sort of informal voting blocks, people who aren't part of any caucus, but vote together very routinely. And these are conservative members of the council and the people we associate with the Chicago machine, all right? Who mostly go together to vote against good government reforms that Lightfoot has proposed. This is the division of the divided roll call votes in the first 2 years. Now, normally when we've looked at these things before with Emmanuel and Daley, the 100% and the 99% are way out. So you have a lot of people voting with 100% of the time. This one, it's much more sparse. We have a large chunk of people who only vote with the mayor about 80% of the time or 70% of the time. Only 2 people, when we did this, voted with 100% of the time. Is actually most recent data I looked at is reduced to 1. So Lightfoot really only has a very small, narrow, much narrower, I shouldn't say small, narrow, but much narrower group of diehard loyalists than other mayors have had. This is kind of another breakdown of it. Traditionally, we would see the high 90s, the 100%, it go way up and then really go down. This kind of looks more like an even distribution of votes, kind of shows how the council council members feel more emboldened to vote against things on individual members. And this is a breakdown of the council, each council member and the percentage they have with the vote. Now, one thing you want to notice about this is that the mean for the whole council tend to approve Lightfoot's legislation about 85% of the time. And then these little, if you notice the little dots here, little stars, these are the council chairs. And Lightfoot chose the council chairs, and overwhelmingly they support with her the majority of the time. There's only 2 council chairs that are really below 90%, or 3 that are below 90% with her. So let's talk about some of the caucuses. So this is the Aldermanic Black Caucus. They're probably the identity caucus that's most supportive of Lightfoot. They have a mean of about 88%, so they vote with her about 80% of the time. The Latino caucus not far behind, about 87%, so kind of essentially a rounding error between the 2. Then we have the LGBTQ caucus. They are so low because of Raymond Lopez, who really is an outliner who consistently votes against nearly everything Lightfoot proposes. If you take out him, obviously you get much higher. You start to look like the Aldermanic and Latino caucus, but with him there, he really drives down the vote. So let's talk about the ideological caucuses. So the first one is the Progressive Caucus. Progressive Caucus actually has a lot of variation in there. And we'll talk about more why that is, but you have some people like Scott Waspak, Susan Garza, who are very supportive of Lightfoot, but you start to go down the ones, you have people who are more opposed to him. And as you see with the next slide, those who are most opposed are those who are also part of the Socialist Caucus, all right? Now, one thing that's unique about Social Caucus is they officially became a caucus on May 1st of this year. And as Daniel said, there's actually 6 socialist people on the city council who are supported by the DSA, but there's only 5 in the caucus. That's because one of them decided to vote with Lightfoot on her budget, and it created tension between him and the rest of the caucus. So he decided not to join the caucus when they officially incorporated on May 1st. So now we're going to talk about the last few voting blocks. This is the conservative voting block. These 3 aldermen all sort of align in conservative issues. They have a mean of 69%. And then the lowest one are people we consider a part of the Chicago machine who routinely vote against good government reforms. Some pretty clear variation between them, but in general, they have the mean of voting together, the lowest percent for with Lightfoot. Issues that have been contentious issues, there are several of them. This is a very contentious council compared to previous administrations. The settlements appointments, those are the machine constantly voting against those. City budget, as I mentioned. Marijuana legalization, that's an issue that Lightfoot and the Aldermanic Caucus, the Aldermanic Black Caucus didn't see eye to eye on. COVID relief powers, the welcoming city ordinance, she really got pushback from conservatives on that. Housing development, the guaranteed basic income program, the renaming of Lakeshore Drive, the condemning of violence in Southeast Asia, there was a resolution at that. Reforming alderman prerogative, police reform, and then this most recent one is talking about disposal utensils and environmental protection, where Scott Waspak actually voted against her, and it's the one time he's voted against her. So Chicago's future. So while the age of rubber stamp city councils has been on decline, it's not automatically guaranteed that just because it's declining, we could see more various councils, not necessarily the guarantee that the council is a representative body. The first 2 years of Lightfoot's administration, we've seen several ideological coherent factions formed, and they're constantly competing for power. Lightfoot's strong victory was an indication that Chicagoans really wanted change in the city, but how that change has been manifested is still unknown. It's kind of an evolving process. And her dual identity as a good government reformer and a progressive advocate really resonated with voters, but there's constantly a question if she's going to fulfill that promise, especially on the side of progressives who feel more burned by Lightfoot and don't feel like she's lived up to her campaign promise. And the last thing, there's a grand arc of history, and people have talked about the modern mayors. You see this line going from Washington to Lightfoot, this confluence of events that kind of led us to this moment. So we see the march of progress continue, but we've got to remember that the struggle for the future of Chicago is still contested, and we are going to probably deal with these issues coming for next several decades of determining the future of Chicago and the two cities that it's become, the tale of two cities it's become.
Thank you, Rosaire. Any questions for just clarification? Okay, Rosaire, you can take down your screen, thanks. So I'm going to cover the concluding chapter where I try and summarize all these 250 pages of material from all the different mayors. And that's an important thing in the book, is to come to a conclusion, and it's not a particularly easy one to do. But there are some themes that do come out in all of the chapters. Obviously, in the last 40 years, we've lived through both establishment machine mayors and periods of their government, and on the other hand, progressive reform eras, and we've gone back and forth again. Our book begins with the progressive era of Mayor Harold Washington, and follows that arc of progressive reform up to Mayor Lori Lightfoot. And Washington is particularly important, as you'll remember from last week and from your general knowledge of Harold's mayoralty. In one sense, you could say he set the stage for what has happened in the last 40 years in Chicago, even with the dialectic or the back and forth. People from his administration phrase it a little differently. They say that Harold Washington set a new floor in city government, that he had policies of balanced economic development, sustained affirmative action, an immigrant welcoming sanctuary city, and major ethics good government reforms. And those have not changed. All the mayors since Harold Washington, Daley, Emanuel, whoever you want to choose, has kept those in place. Now, they may not have had the same enthusiasm for them, and they may not have moved them forward, and they may have had other agendas, but the argument is Harold Washington raised this floor from, say, the Richard J. Daley era, the earlier eras in Chicago. And you have to remember with the Harold Washington period that this happened even in the midst of the Council Wars battle. Now in the book, what we try and do is to trace this zigzag of political history. And to do that, we cover certain key themes in each of the chapters. One of the themes is economic development. We look at the change that's happening as these mayors are in power between first what was a manufacturing economy, and then what is a service economy, and now what has become a global economy. And what contribution did each mayor make to that transformation? We looked at the decline in population that began back in the 1970s and 80s. Back then, it's hard to remember now, but we were losing in the 70s and early 80s 25,000 jobs a year, 12,500 units of housing a year, and 60,000 people a year. We lost 250,000 jobs in a single decade. But that looks like it is now bottomed out, as the authors were saying in this discussion today. That we always hope for a rebirth of Chicago, a revitalization. partly because governing is so much easier if you have resources, and you get resources if you just keep the taxes the same, but you get more economic activity, you have more money to run the government. We have watched a very fundamental change in the racial balance of power. Before Harold Washington, there's no doubts that whites were in control and sole control of the city, even though there was a black submachine, and later Latinos began to develop a stronger political base. Now, to use Rozaire's terms, it's more contested. Each of the racial groups have a stake and are fighting for power, and the whites are no longer automatically in charge. And the same kind of tension between the establishment or the machine and the reform elements, we have created new amalgams of machine and reform. The Richard M. Daley was different from Richard J. Daley. The Rahm Emanuel was different than any mayor probably we've had in Chicago, and Lori Lightfoot is different. So the balance between machine and or establishment and reform is constantly changing back and forth, and we try and trace that with a lot of detail in the book. So as we come into the Lori Lightfoot time, particularly, and even across all 5 regimes, we see Chicago as governing in a time of challenges and crises. I won't go over all of them in the earlier period, but the 2008 housing crisis, the 2001 terrorist attack crisis, there were many crises in between that each mayor has had to deal with. And tracing out what those are and how they deal with them is part of the story of each mayoral era. And we must also notice that they're each contending with both the forces of metropolitanization. After all, 3/4 of the people in the metropolitan region live outside the city of Chicago, and globalization, the forces of globalization and the pressure on not only the economy, but society, and as we found in the pandemic, even health. And last of all, these mayors have been trying to accomplish this, particularly more and more as we go further into the current time, with a national politics of gridlock and polarization. It's not like the national government has been a great ally of the cities over the last 40 years and somehow made the task of governing the cities easy. Now, as we look at the 5 mayors, we begin to notice that there is one universal goal, as there is for the aldermen and the other people who are in power. And the universal goal is economic development. They all want to have economic development, and that goes back to the very first of Chicago's history. We would still be just a little trading post and a couple of settlers and maybe a fort if it wasn't that Chicago was located at the node of the river and the lake. So we first became the nexus of trade and commerce because of our location on the river or the lake, but we were a swamp and the river and the lake didn't really connect. So we built the Illinois-Michigan Canal, which made everything connect and made it possible for us to become the center of transportation on the waterways. Next, we became the center of transportation on the railways. We were fortunate that Abraham Lincoln helped us in this regard. He required that all of the, essentially, the great infrastructure program that ran all the railways through Chicago in the Midwest, as opposed to, they could have just as easily, in fact, more easily gone through, for instance, St. Louis. And that could have become the nexus of the railways. We obviously became, under the Eisenhower period and later, the expressway hub of the roads. And that is important, not only because of a lot of cars, but because of the truck traffic. Again, you can load in Chicago off of any of these different modes. We became an air hub of the nation, a central hub of both 2 major airlines, but many airlines that fly in and out of Chicago at our 2 airports. Now, despite all that economic success of becoming a nexus for the country and the world. We also hit downward trends. I already mentioned a bit the problems of the 1970s and the 1980s. It was a period of deindustrialization, and Maureen, particularly in our next session, is going to talk about that as it affected other cities, but that deindustrialization affected Chicago. But our mayors were able to help us enter and become the global capital of the Midwest, particularly Daley and Emanuel. One can still not like Daley and Emanuel on many grounds, but you have to give them some credit for moving us forward as a global city. Now, the one problem, as both papers have indicated, is while we did have some economic recovery and success from the deindustrialization period, we were not able to always get what under Washington was called balanced economic development. Economic development that benefited, as we've been talking about today, the two cities or the three cities of Chicago. And we see Lightfoot again taking up the task, particularly most notably with their Invest Southwest program, which is to invest in the 10 neighborhoods that are among the poorest, and to bring up, therefore, again, the Harold Washington balanced economic development idea. You can also see it in her new budget where she uses federal money to pump $1 billion into new social and economic projects in the neighborhoods, not downtown. Now, Daley and Emanuel, even though they may have done something to make us a global city, or at least presided over the period when we became a global city, did focus primarily on the downtown and the lakefront. They were builder mayors with these mega projects. That's a different strategy than we saw under Washington and Sawyer and Lightfoot. Nonetheless, when you look at it as a whole over a longer historic period, we have to conclude that the gap between the rich and the poor has only grown since Richard J. Daley. And so we have also moved from segregation to discrimination, but we're still one of the most segregated cities in North America. Our income inequality is at an unacceptable level, and crime remains a major problem, as Rosaire was telling from the chapter on Lori Lightfoot. A couple of more points just about what we find that's common among the chapters, or the themes that the chapters have to deal with. What we find is that in Chicago, race and politics are intertwined, with the mayor needing to win at least 2 of the 3 major racial groups to be successful. So Harold Washington won the blacks, and after the first election, ever more the Latinos and part of a rainbow coalition. Sawyer was elected by white machine aldermen and then abandoned by then, but supported by the traditional black community. Daley had, Richard M. Daley had the support of whites and Latinos, but not blacks. Emanuel had whites and blacks for most of his term until that began to change in the second Emanuel administration. And Lori Lightfoot had this unusual coalition of whites and LGBTQ. So, and Lori Lightfoot is unique since the high point of Richard M. Daley and the high point of Richard J. Daley, and getting 74% in the general election. Now, just briefly, a couple of more points. First of all, we trace in most of the chapters how the mayor's policies follow their coalition of supporters. And we particularly use the examples of Daley and Emanuel and Lightfoot. And Rosaire particularly was talking about the struggle and difficulty of Lightfoot trying to find policies to satisfy both the Good Government Coalition and the Progressive Coalition. Just a couple of more things. Again, the theme throughout the book is how the mayors dealt with challenges and crises. Just to list a few of them that are more current in this period of time. In 2001, we had a an economic crisis created by the terrorist attacks. In 2008, Chicago suffered the Great Recession because of the housing boom and bust. We're suffering currently the pandemic and the economic recession that has continued since the pandemic or during the recurring pandemic. And we've had protests and crimes, both particularly notable in the Emanuel and the Lightfoot period. Now, we also are the subject, mentioned just in passing, of both national and international forces. The decisions about many things that affect us most are made by transnational corporations whose CEOs don't even live here, neither do their board of directors. We're affected by national policies like immigration. We're a city of immigrants, and yet we don't control immigration policy. We've been affected internationally by COVID-19, which, whether it came from, you want to say it came from China or other places and get into that argument, it came from somewhere beyond our borders. We didn't create COVID here. We had COVID inflicted upon us. Finally, we have, beyond just these things, we've had a federal funding problem since Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump, and is now reversing, hopefully, with Biden, if Biden particularly can get the two bills that are present in the Congress currently through. And all of our mayors, it doesn't really matter which one, have been big proponents of, please give us money. The one thing you could nearly always count on, except in council wars for some special reasons, was that the alderman and the mayor would be on the same page. Sure, apply for money for the homeless. Oh, apply for money for streets. Oh, we'd like a new sewer. Hell, we'll take federal money for anything. We need the federal money, and we've not been getting it for 40 years. Let me conclude. Chicago politics and government is certainly different today than it was 40 years ago before Harold Washington. And the challenge is still the same in a way. It's making Chicago an equitable and livable global city in the midst of the 21st century. And what is unique in human history, succeeding as a multicultural, multiracial society in doing this. And so what we try and do simply is to document the struggles of the last 40 years so that they can help us understand our challenges and help us choose a better future. And now we'll go to Clinton Stockwell to talk about generally how we go about this kind of research, and also a bit, Clinton has compiled for the book a 12-page single-spaced bibliography of sort of the great writings of Chicago. And this would be hard to do for other cities. And it's usually claimed we are the most studied city in the United States. And there are reasons for that. But Clinton, why don't you see what you can have to say and reflect upon your years of study and research on Chicago type topics, and what sort of resources we have in the city to at least reflect on what happens.
Yes, thank you, Dick. I presume you can all hear me okay? Is that?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. Well, I'm glad to be part of this discussion. I must say from the beginning that my research orientation was influenced by some organizations that were working on social justice issues. The former Urban Training Institute program, another program called the Chicago Urban Academy. The focus was what was going on in the neighborhood or the parish. And so that's going to skew my comments a little bit, but I think might also give you all another window in terms of how to look at research for a city like Chicago. And you notice already from the Daley, Richard M. Daley, I think there are two really significant books on Richard M. Daley. And we have one very good one from Carrie on Emanuel. There is not yet a book, although there looks like to be one in the making from Dick and Mr. Rossi. And also you notice that there were different research approaches. What I've always admired about Carrie for a long time, and hello again, Carrie, we know each other, I think, is that Carrie is very interested in what's going on the ground with community-based organizations around issues that face people in the city. And that's where her heart is, and that's where her research is. And so that's very different than maybe the kind of research you might find in an academic book that is done in a research library. That might include web pages and might include databases, but maybe not so much in touch with neighborhood stuff. And Mr. Rossi, I have to really say I very admire what you just shared with us, because the kind of stuff he shared is not going to be found in many books either. He's going to have to go to City Hall and some libraries where he can get information about voting patterns of aldermen. And so that to me was very refreshing. So in other words, there are a lot of ways that people can do research in Chicago. Now, let me talk about bibliographies. And so here's the semi 12-page bibliography. And this is how I use it. I'm using this book called Us versus Them by, it's a wonderful book by John Doring on Uptown and Rogers Park. And what Doring does, I love. The same thing with Carla Shedd. Yeah, this book here on schools in Chicago, Unequal City. He's using a lot of interviews. And so the interviews give stories about what's happening in neighborhoods that you're not going to get in other places. You might get from newspaper sources. Doring also has a wonderful bibliography in the back. So this kind of gets into my bibliography piece. And what I do when there's a book like this that has a really good detailed bibliography is that I will go through it very carefully, and I will check off those resources that I didn't know about or that I have a particular interest in. So I think that's really the focus of a bibliography such as this one. Suppose you have a topic that you're interested in, then I would kind of go through this very carefully and sort of check out maybe the half a dozen most important books that you think would be good background for your topic, and then find a way to consult those books. And so after I've done that, if I'm writing on a particular issue, like maybe it's Mexicans in Pilsen, or maybe it's the politics of Uptown. You got Larry Bennett's work, and a guy named Todd Gitlin wrote a book on Uptown many years past. And then now you have this modern one by Doring on Us versus Them. And then I would look in those books and I would try to see what are their footnotes and what is in their bibliography and where did they get their stuff. And that would be the beginning for me to accumulate my own bibliography for my own topic. So that's the way I would use any bibliography. Go through it, pick out the ones that are of interest to you, check them out, look at their own footnotes and bibliography and see which ones are interesting to your own topic. The other thing that you want to do is you want to look at the table of contents, and you may find in a general book on a general neighborhood or general topic, you may find some discussion of an issue more specific to your topic that you want to look at. So that's how I use general bibliographies. Okay, let me talk a bit about my own experiences, because it's a little bit different maybe than what the usual academic in the high tower of his office in a library might do. For example, I did 8 neighborhoods histories in this Encyclopedia Chicago, now 20 or 30 years ago. Now, let me tell you how I did these neighborhood histories. Coming from an experiential background, and I directed a program called Chicago Semester, which was about internships and experiential learning, where we try to get out of the classroom in the library and into those places, into those neighborhoods, okay? And so the way I researched those neighborhoods is that, okay, I can find stuff at the Chicago Historical Society, great. Or the public library, great. UIC has an incredible database collection that Dick Simpson should should talk about, that he knows more about that than any of us here. And those are really good places to go. But I liked going to the neighborhood, and I liked walking in those neighborhoods. And I like going to the local libraries in those places and to ask them if they have a file on their neighborhood, which I mined. And often I found that there were studies and papers that were written by people who lived in those places or knew about them that I could not find in other libraries. So I had more of an experiential encounter with the place, and maybe more of a hands-on look at the place and also the local library in terms of what was available at the local level. So that's kind of the way I did these neighborhood histories for the Encyclopedia of Chicago. I wanted to have a feel for that place, not just the literary resources on the place. Now, another experience that I had in doing research, again, this is gonna be a little bit different than what you're hearing from other people. I did this master's project in urban planning at UIC. And by the way, UIC has the Great Cities Institute and also the Voorhees Center, which is about economic development investment in local neighborhoods. And those are some great places that very few university systems have. So I do recommend that. So, and we had to do an internship at UIC. So it wasn't just academic, but we had to kind of have more of an encounter with the place or with the city beyond just an academic understanding of it. So that's something I've always been very committed to, as one committed to experiential education. But this is what I did. I was interested in immigration policy in Uptown. So I have a place-based area that I could do the background information of what is Uptown, where are the boundaries. By the way, there are 3 boundaries when you look at Chicago. There are neighborhood boundaries, about 200 something of them. Those are smaller. There are ward boundaries, about 50 of those, of course, and the community area boundaries. There are 77 of those. So when you're doing a study that's place-based, you need to be sure about what your boundaries are, what stats you're looking for. Then you can decide where to find information. But in dealing with immigration policy, I didn't have time or to interview a lot of immigrants, which was a great loss. Plus, there are some university barriers to doing that protects privacy issues. So I decided that I'm going to interview agency directors. And this is not a half a dozen people. This is about 30 people that are dealing with immigration issues in Uptown and the environments. You have the Cambodians, you have the Ethiopians, you had a lot of different Asian groups, so a lot of agencies to talk to. And I developed a questionnaire. This is another way to do research. And I wanted to know 2 things. I wanted to know what were the barriers for immigrants to fully incorporate and become settled in a city like Chicago. What prohibited them from doing such? The other thing I wanted to know from the agency directors, what did they need? What were they doing? I need to know that. But what did they need, or what did they think their clientele needed, so that they would have the tools and resources by which to be better integrated into the neighborhood? It had to do with long-term funding for housing. It had to do with job education. That were the 2 major things. So I had the questionnaire and I had my questions, and there was a fairly lengthy questionnaire that I developed. There was a Chicago, there was a Hull House group there at the time that I worked with, along with another group, the Chicago Uptown Center. That's not right, it's something like that. I'm blanking on it. So I had my questionnaire, and I set up time with each of these agency leaders, okay? And I interviewed them with a set of maybe 2 dozen questions. And that became the subject of my master's thesis. So there you have 2 very different ways of doing research that is not just done in a library. Now, I did a PhD thing in urban history that was about early Chicago. None of you are interested in early Chicago. If you were, and you sent it to Perry Dewis, then Perry Dewis said, you're not going to get a PhD from me unless you go to the Historical Museum and mine through all those period papers from the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So I did that library trip, but I was much more interested in what's going on in Chicago today. So engaging agency leaders and walking in those neighborhood and community areas, and then finding out more about them was my approach to doing research. Now, I'm going to skip down. I've got a formal thing that I can mail to you, Dick, and I'm going to skip down more towards the end because I know I'm running out of time, and get to locating research. This is kind of one piece I'll leave you with, and I'll send this piece to Dick to circulate to you if you like it. So where do you go to find information? Well, you can certainly go to the big libraries, and the data collection at UIC is among the best in the city. So be sure to do that. There's a historical society, there's a Newberry Library, then there's the local libraries and the public libraries where I would go. Mine those data collections. There are at least two people in the university system you need to talk to. Your advisor. You need to have a proposal, of course, and this is my proposal, what I want to do. Share that with your advisor for the advisor's feedback. Then talk to your local librarian once you know what your idea is, and that person, if competent, will show you a myriad of ways to look. It might be in newspaper clippings, it might be in journals, it might be in periodicals. Those are all really good. It may be monographs, a number of different specific data collections that you would want to look at. You also want to look at newspapers. And I think in particular for Chicago, there's a Tribune, Sun-Times, Crane, Chicago Business. I think it's a Southtown Economist, and there are others that are really good if you want to look at contemporary Chicago and the issues that we see today. But then I want to introduce something else for you to think about. As I mentioned, both of these books, what makes Unequal City and Us versus Them very rich for me is that those authors did interviews of residents and agency leaders who were on the ground, who knew from their own personal experience what those issues were. As a little side story, I used to do these classes called Metropolitan Seminar, and we would read books on public housing. Fine. But the best way to find out about public housing, and I did this with a friend, Arbus Averett, we would go into public housing and talk to residents and talk to the community organization leaders and talk to people who are maybe managing those projects, because those stories were a lot richer to me and more accurate than some academic footnote, honestly. And the best academic footnotes, I think, are going to be those connected to the actual experience of people who are living in these places. So I really think that depending on what you're trying to do, if you can get to an agency head, if you can get to a person who is an authority on the issue or concern that you have, if you can talk to actual residents who are in public housing, who are recent immigrants, who are homeless on the street, those stories are going to be a lot richer and going to make for a lot more interesting story than just doing your pure academic research. So I hope that's helpful for you. I think between Dick Simpson, who's done everything, by the way, that I've just talked about, and the other actors, there's a lot of folks to act here about how to do research on your topic. So I hope that we have some discussion about that. Thank you, Dick.
Thank you, Clinton. Just one other resource for you that Clinton didn't mention is there is now, after a decade of work, one-stop shopping for figuring out where collections are held and that may have the sources you want. And the way to do it is to Google Explore Chicago Collections. Chicago Collections is 30 different museums and libraries, including UIC and the Historical Association, but a lot of them you don't know about and may never heard of that are more particular to topic. And so you can find out that, for instance, if you wanted to know where are Jane Addams' papers, because you wanted to write about Hull House, They happen to be at UIC, but you might not know that. You can find that out from Explore Chicago Collections, and they will have on Chicago Collections. By the way, they have, I don't know whether it's 100,000 photographs, but if you want to illustrate your book and you need a Chicago photograph, also Explore Chicago Collections has thousands of photographs, not just written documents. And it is a wonderful new resource that we didn't have back in the day. So if you're trying to find out where things are, they also have what are called finder's guides, which means you can not only find out that the Jane Addams papers are at UIC, but you can get a sense of what's in, say, the Richard J. Daley papers or the Jane Addams papers or whatever. It's a very unique and new resource that makes certain early stages of research easy before you do all the hard work Clinton's talking about doing. Okay, we're open for questions to any of the authors about any of the mayors or about doing research from different perspectives. Carrie is really a journalist and teaches at Medill. Clinton has had a varied background, as you can hear, from urban planning and urban history and other fields. We should be able to provide some useful answers to some of your questions. So Mitch, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so Carrie, this goes off of the question that you kind of posed, which was, can the most vulnerable in the corporate sector both thrive in Chicago? And this is a thread that we've talked about, I think, multiple times now in this class, that kind of dichotomy. And I'm just curious what your thoughts to that question, what your thoughts on the answer to that question might be. And if anyone else on the call would be interested in answering that as well, about, you know, what are the ways we balance that and how do mayors successfully do that?
Yeah, thanks for revisiting that. I mean, it's a huge question. It's probably like the $1 million question for every city. My quick answer is, I think, yes, at least to a, you know, with a greater degree of equality and equity. I mean, on the most basic level, even if, you know, your priority is like the business class and the sort of, you know, higher income neighborhoods, like Chicago, crime alone in Chicago has gotten so much, you know, international bad press that is hurting the business sector. So even if you don't actually care about the neighborhoods with violence, you know, you're actually going to improve the city as a whole if you're able to meaningfully invest in those neighborhoods and help reduce the crime and the segregation and, you know, but on hopefully that's not actually the motivation. Hopefully the motivation is, you know, that the city, everyone in the city does actually thrive and have their needs met. So, you know, I think it's just a lot harder actually than like someone, just for example, like Ram definitely knows what it takes to attract headquarters and to attract, you know, the top talent from all different sectors to come to Chicago. And he did do a great job of that by most measures. But, you know, it's a lot harder to actually serve a much larger constituency. And, you know, it's slower, it's less efficient, it's maybe costlier on the front end, but, you know, ideally financially the bottom line looks better in the long run too, or even if it doesn't, you know. So yeah, I mean, I think the quick answer is yes, but it takes a lot of hard work, a lot more willingness to listen to experts and to regular people on the ground, and to spend money, you know, to not prioritize necessarily balancing the budget or attracting global investment as the top priority, and to be willing to actually keep spending on things like mental health clinics that, you know, appear inefficient in the short term. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, and including yours, anyone.
Rosaire, you probably have some thoughts about that topic.
I would say a thing to keep in mind is that the two things that I think business most fears from governments is high progressive taxation and taking over industries and the cities of municipalization. And on a local level here in Chicago, those are really confined by the constraints that the state put on. So the option that usually cities revert to is boosterism, where they try to produce economic growth that kind of benefits multiple sectors of society. I think the question that Chicago faces is our boosterism going to be one that is trying to pick up the most disadvantaged neighborhoods and really invest in those to grow their population so we can get people into those areas to feed the city's revenue base as a whole? Or is it going to be one that takes the well-off neighborhoods and strategically invests in those to expand those? And I think that's the real question that underlies Chicago politics, more so than, it's more about wealthy neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods than necessarily business leads versus the poor. It's that the business of poor kind of goes to that neighborhood line. So that's how I would kind of answer that, is like what type of boosterism does Chicago want to adopt as a city? Which one do we think would be more successful for it?
Other questions or comments? You're welcome to comment on it. We'd love to have comments on the draft chapters because that can make them better.
I could just add a quick point, Dick.
Go ahead, Clinton.
The Chicago's politics is not limited, of course, to what goes on in City Hall, nor is it limited to what aldermen do. There are numerous advocacy organizations and civil society organizations that, if they are not vital, issues of inequity and for what one needs to be do for the vulnerable among us, they're likely not going to be addressed very well unless there's an organized constituency at the grassroots that's lobbying for them in some fashion.
Yes, go ahead, David. And then Daniel, I'll come. Did you want to comment, Daniel, on the last?
Yeah, very briefly. I think I see Chicago as being kind of close to an inflection point that puts various groups, anti-progressive tax business leaders, community groups, various factions on the city council, in somewhat of a dicey position, which is that the level of rot in municipal finance is strong enough that it could be structurally very difficult to escape on the one hand. And on the other, if we do slip out of it, the dynamics in urban development and real estate in Chicago are such that the city is naturally inclined to turn inside out in a way that would really basically deport poor people to the fringes in a very Parisian kind of style. And neither of those are good outcomes for the city. And all sides of the debate, as I say, are uncomfortably close to this inflection point at which it could tip either way, and they've got to accommodate that, is what I kind of suspect.
David, you were next.
Thank you, Professor. I was just skimming through the book, Us versus Them by Doring, and actually I'm trying to write a paper on homelessness and gentrification in urban cities. And I see that this book, it talks about mostly racial issues, crime, gentrification. I think it's going to be very useful for this, but I just wanted to ask any of the speakers, like, for a recommendation on how to abort, how to cover or to think about this issue of homelessness for research purposes.
Well, there are some resources. The Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, for instance, tries to keep track of how many homeless there are, and they dispute the city numbers, and they advocate for what's wrong. There's some pretty surprising figures. For instance, their overall figure is 80,000 homeless in Chicago. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's 15,000 school children are homeless. And so on. So you can start with some basics from the homeless advocacy groups, not just the Chicago Coalition, but also depending on which part of the city you're interested in, Northside Housing is one of the best to go to on the north side. you may have to do what Clinton suggested. You may have to actually interview these organizations, maybe go to some of the shelters like the one at People's Church on Lawrence Avenue to get some of the answers that you're seeking. Anyone else on the homeless question before?
I can real briefly, it's a huge issue and related to gentrification, but also really separate. You know, gentrification, you have to keep in mind that part of gentrification, as I'm sure you well know, is people moving because, you know, either because of property taxes, but moving somewhere where they, I mean, if they're selling, you know, they at least have that nest egg from the sale of their house. So I don't know to what degree people displaced from home ownership through gentrification or homeless. I'm guessing that's not like a huge portion. Of course, rents going up in gentrifying areas, people are displaced and, you know, may end up homeless. But then in Chicago, like really mental health and criminal records are such a huge part of the homelessness issue that's, you know, both related to gentrification, but also its whole own other monsters. And there's definitely groups that work on, you know, a lot of great groups that work on mental health issues and substance abuse. Again, all these things interrelated. So, you know, I think when you're covering homelessness, you probably want to really narrow down, you know, what is it homelessness caused by gentrification, and if so, what kind of data can you get about or anecdotes? So you know, this is a whole long conversation and I'd love to talk separately at some point if you want, but the groups, you know, you're not necessarily just going to be going to housing groups if you're covering homelessness. Really, substance abuse and mental health providers are probably major sources for you on that issue too.
Let's take some other questions and then we can come back to specific topics like homelessness. Guadalupe, you're next.
Thank you. My question's for Mr. Rossi. I really appreciated the different city council caucuses that you shared, the identity ones, the ideological ones. And it made me wonder, how do caucuses get formed? How do people decide which identity they want to identify with? Because there isn't like a woman caucus. Do you think that that's something that could happen? And the reason I'm wondering is because if there isn't a group that's advocating for a population, then I think it leaves that population more vulnerable. There isn't anybody that's talking about period poverty, and that's, you know, a woman issue. So could there be a women caucus?
I think that there could totally be a woman or a feminist caucus formed within the Chicago City Council. I don't know the nitty-gritty specifics about how the council does form caucuses. I know they have an official process to declare, but I can say that caucuses are a really recent phenomenon. The first caucus was the Progressive Reform Caucus that formed at the tail end of the second Daley's time as mayor. And then after they formed, the other caucuses started to form during Rahm Emanuel's, and the Socialist Caucus is the most recent one that formed during Lightfoot's term. So they are really recent, and you have to remember that the city of Chicago is dominated by one political party, the Democratic Party. So how do you determine political distinctions when you're dominated by one political party? The caucuses are sort of a way for people to determine political distinctions, whip votes, create alliances within the context that we don't have a sort of a unique multi-party system that you would have in other areas. So that's really why they exist. I'm sure that if a council member is really interested in it, they could form a feminist caucus or women caucus. It just, for whatever reason, they haven't found the need. You know, they see those policies being addressed in other areas.
Let me
but take it up with your alter.
Slight correction to Rozier. We didn't used to call them caucuses exactly, but we did form back in the 70s, and this probably is the first of them to form. And I was there at the founding. We had the terms we used then were independent and machine. Today we'd probably call it reform and establishment. But several of us simply got together. It was mostly motivated by Linda Prey, who was 5th Ward Alderman, Billy Singer, who was 43rd Ward Alderman, and I said, let's get together, let's meet at least once a month before the city council meeting and pool our resources. We were only 7. We included Republicans as well as what we would call progressive aldermen these days. And the reason we could do that is the definition we had for being a part of the caucus is you didn't believe Richard J. Daley was omnipotent. That is, you'd be willing to oppose the mayor and the machine. And whether you were doing that as the most conservative member, who was Father Lawler, who was partly racist, white clergyman on the southwest side of Chicago, was part of our caucus because he didn't follow Richard J. Daley and the machine line slavishly. But the basic idea is 2 or 3 aldermen get together and they say, we want to form this group. We're concerned, we think we have this common affinity. We want to pool our resources because we recognize that as individuals, we can't push the agenda that we care about and our constituents care about as an individual. We just don't, aldermen have only 3 staff members, more or less. And, if you're looking at the city budget, which this year is 500 pages, 200,000 line items, and you want to come up to for amendments to the city budget, one poor alderman with 3 staff members, a number of whom are tied up in doing things like the service requests, can't begin to analyze a city budget. Whereas if you're the progressive caucus with 18 members, then you can each take a different branch. One of you can be in charge of the housing department, and one of you can be looking at the other office, like the inspector general's office or whichever. And you can divide up the budget and you can come up to recommendations. And that's how you get amendments to the city budget, is you've got not just a lone alderman coming up with an amendment by themselves, but working together. And the same is true on laws. And it works the same way with the Black Caucus or the African American Caucus in opposing marijuana licenses. It isn't that they didn't want to see marijuana licenses. It brings revenue in for the city. Some of their constituents would like to have access to marijuana legally, but they wanted to make sure that African Americans had a fair share of the profits from the marijuana industry. So because they were a caucus and they had this notion they could get something done. They might lose in the vote in the city council. I lost nearly every major vote in the city council during my 8 years there, but the strange thing that happened was my legislation passed as the Mayor Richard J. Daley ordinance on such and such after I had introduced it and it had been voted down in the city council. Same with Linda Prey or Billy Singer or Marty Overman or the others who came along. But it is an interesting question of what caucuses and factions you have is very important in understanding the legislative process of either the city council or the state legislature or the Congress. Daniel, did you want to comment on this point before we go to Rodrigo?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think Guadalupe's question, I think, also raises just a general question of how you would go about studying this topic. And I'm all in favor of a comparative approach, as Dick, as you know, and it's one parallel here is that I actually do think U.S. cities have been surprisingly quiescent in some respects on feminist politics. If you want to find a more active scene, London in the 1980s would be a good place to start. You had a very active feminist element in politics. In contrast, relatively quiescent racial politics in London, but I think that's part of just the extreme diversity of the place. There isn't enough for any one group to gain critical mass. But it launched, it launched some political careers. I think Harriet Harman, Tessa Jowell, Diane Abbott certainly come to mind. It launched it launched, I think, a broader sensitivity to women's issues, both at the borough and county level there. And at the same time, of course, launched 1,000 negative stereotypes in the conservative press, who would have this habit of calling up borough council press officers at about 4:59 on a Friday with some accusation. And obviously no one was in a position to confirm or deny it at 4:59 on a Friday. And then they'd run some crazy story about manhole covers being renamed. But that would be a good place to start. Susan Feinstein has covered some of that in her research, just to take one example of something you may have well have covered in your graduate studies.
Daniel, while you are there, could you just mention your dissertation and book, but particularly your dissertation and how you set up comparative urban studies for middle-sized cities and what it was you were studying?
And even some quite small towns. So the dissertation was called Defining the Path to Growth, Small Town Governance and Economic Development in an Age of Globalization. What I did, I mean, one of my big concerns with urban politics and policy studies in general is that they're just, there's even now a considerable ongoing neglect of what happens directly as a result of state policy or just indirectly as a result of being in a particular state. The other thing is small to medium-sized towns on a per capita basis tend to have smaller municipal budgets than a place like Chicago. So they actually, from my perspective, formed kind of an ideal case study for stress testing how municipalities go about economic development in a holistic and inclusive manner. So I took two small towns in Illinois, one of them even smaller towns in Minnesota, and compared them pretty exhaustively with a lot of elite interviewing of stakeholders, bureaucrats, elected officials, people involved with community groups and so on, to get a handle on how they were going about economic development in an institutional and organizational frame.
Thank you. Rodrigo, you had a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Professor Simpson. I have a question about this back and forth dynamics between reform administrations and establishment administrations and how to conceptualize it. There is a recent book on Sao Paulo politics by Eduardo Marques, he's the editor, in which there's this interesting conceptualization of this sort of long-term incremental progressivism within the city. And I was wondering, especially based on Washington Herald's administration, if the concept travels at all, this idea that certain coalitions would allow for progressive agendas to be set forth, for a certain amount of redistribution to be to take place, and that sort of progressive gain, so to speak, would not suffer a huge setback because of electoral pressures and coalitions and so forth. Do we see that sort of long-term incremental progressivism in Chicago, or is it a different pattern? Is it policy-based? What would be the sort of long-term pattern here?
Betty, I'm going to let you come in on that if you want. The long-term patterns, you're muted though.
You want me to go into history?
Well, shorter history, yes.
I was thinking the whole time everybody was talking about this, about Mayor Ed Kelly. And he was the mayor in the 30s. And one of the things that he did was, he was an established guy. He was one of the guys that got the Democratic machine going. He was one of those guys that worked with the movers and shakers. However, one of the things that he did was he listened to Eleanor Roosevelt, and he believed in reform and helping the poor. And so he did both things. And I don't know how or why this disappeared, but it disappeared. He couldn't keep it all together, but he was for racial relations to improve. He was for stuff like that. And he got thrown out because he became unpopular with a lot of other things that he was doing all sorts of wrong, but also because of his stand on race. And so when you say that there's never been somebody that is completely establishment or completely progressive, we have guys that can do it. I don't know why or how this things happen, but I don't know if I'm even answering the question, but that was the thing that I was seeing. But if we have somebody like Rahm Emanuel who's running around with tips and getting all the rich guys to get everything they want, and then he allows the Laquan McDonald thing to happen because he wants to get reelected, I don't know if that's a guy that's doing both things.
Any of the other authors want to chime in before we go to Walt? Rosaire?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I think there's a really strong case for incremental progressivism. I think that you can really draw a pretty straight line between Washington and today, especially, Washington, he signed the Shachtman Decree, which ended political hiring in Chicago, and he declared the machine dead, dead, dead. That wasn't necessarily the case, but when we look at it by the 2019 election, a lot of those people just didn't have the support they had, and they didn't have sort of the patronage empires that had built up because generation ago political hiring was canceled out. So I think it just takes time, and you're right that incremental progressivism, eventually it catches up, but it may catch up decades later. You'll see the effects of it.
Okay, Wu-Jay. Need to unmute.
So, my question was, so I'm trying to research who has power in Chicago. And we've been talking about, well, earlier, like booster economy. We're trying to make sure there's economic growth in Chicago. And we also talked about, well, one of your books talked about how Mayor Emanuel tried to get the foreign investment in. And earlier in the course, we learned about like the importance of globalization in Chicago and how the mayors are trying to make sure the jobs are coming in into Chicago, and that we also heard like project-wise, Chicago was one of the. Is it still? I don't know that like there are many big projects in Chicago, and that made like project-wise Chicago #1. I think I briefly heard that too. So my question is, when I'm trying to answer the question of who has power in Chicago, we seem to be talking a lot about mayors, but I also know that business people go to mayors to get help with their problems, zoning or otherwise. If this guy is real estate zoning, I guess. Would it be fair to say that Chicago, in Chicago, people who actually have power are the business people, not the mayors? Or do you think that's not the case? That's my question.
Clinton, you were the first to want to answer that.
Yes. There are a couple of overarching sort of phrases that you might want to look at. The first one, of course, the big city machine, the boss.
Right.
And then there's a book, Regime Politics on Atlanta. And I'm not sure if Chicago is a regime, but to what extent might there be a regime? Doug Gills and I did a little paper once on the Growth Coalition, and which was the connection between the business community and the political community. So that's another phrase that's out there. And I've been out of school for a while. Professor Simpson can probably tell you some of the more recent phraseology out there. But I think you're right. In the Third City by Bennett, he says, well, Richard M. Daley did not have a political machine like Richard J. Daley, because his machine was a bit different because it involved the business community. And I think there's some books out there on neoliberalism that maybe have been discussed as well. And I think what neoliberalism means is that folks like R.M. Daley and Rahm have been really trying to connect with the global economy in ways that gives up a lot to get them to come here. And I think that's the Boeing story.
Daniel?
Yeah, so first thing, before I go into the main part, I want to just unpackage something there that Boon Jay said, and that is he was sort of mentioning projects and infrastructure and Chicago #1, and there's two different things going on there. Chicago led during the 2010s on a very specific measure in terms of the total number of major projects gaining major private business development projects gaining foreign direct investment. When it comes to infrastructure, I think there was a clear, I'm not sure how much the overall production of it increased, but there was a clear shift from projects that were very geographically centered and neighborhood identified to dealing with citywide problems such as the CTA, streets and infrastructure, the deep tunnel project, and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of the question of who has power, the book that Clinton references, Governing Atlanta, 1946-88 by Clarence Stone, obviously is a seminal work in the question of establishing, are there urban regimes? It's a book that has been significantly criticized as espousing a model that applies rather well to the American South and not so well to other parts of the world. But I think, and of course, Stone since then has been doing work mostly in the field of education reform. But again, I think looking at who has power, looking at questions of who has power in this area. I think with regard to Chicago, in a paradoxical way, Daley and Emanuel became proportionally more dependent on the corporate community than Daley Sr. had been. And once you dismantle a machine, once you whittle down in the space of 30, 35 years from somewhere in the order of 40,000 patronage employees to 5,000 patronage employees and continuing to trend down, you have a situation where it's got to come from somewhere, and it can no longer come in a command and control format. So it becomes more of a transactional relationship between what are you willing to do for me in return for my campaign donation. So we've seen campaign expenditures rise enormously, and we've seen pay-to-play politics, I think, not so much go away as evolve in a different direction and become more diffuse. But at the same time, as mentioned earlier, there's been this increase in general basic standards. This thing that I think it was Rosaire said, and I think Dick alluded to it as well, establishing a floor in city governance. I realize it's kind of a multifaceted answer, not a simple answer, but I don't think the business community is any less represented than they were in, let's say, 1960.
I'm just
Sorry?
confused about like in Atlanta, the Coca-Cola guy was really big.
Mhm.
I forgot his name, but
I'm blanking on it as well.
but here it doesn't sound like we don't really talk about, oh, like the big four Chicago top business people. These guys are important because they're pumping money in or something. We don't say that.
I think in part because we're a bigger city. You've got to realize Atlanta is maybe 500,000 in heels in terms of the city itself. And once you get outside of Atlanta into North Fulton, which basically wants to secede, and into certain parts of the neighborhood, like certain parts of the city, like Buckhead, which themselves want to secede, and South Fulton, which is its own little bubble of segregated minority poverty, and not to mention the suburban counties, which are in their own little world, and they have to run MARTA through a joint powers agreement through the 3 counties that would agree to join it. It's a much, what's left in Atlanta and its establishment itself is actually a relatively small group of people. It's a larger crowd in Chicago because it's a bigger city. You're going to see this elsewhere in the Midwest. You're not going to, I mean, you go to Des Moines and you used to see John Ruan all the time. Today you see Fred Hubble all the time. You're not going to see in Chicago quite so much the same people showing up over and over again.
Carrie, you were responding.
Yeah, just, I mean, the question of power and what it is and who holds it in a city is huge and super interesting. I think you're asking in terms of development projects specifically. And, you know, I think there it depends on the individual project. It's not like there's a handful of individual rich people or companies that are pulling all the strings and, you know, deciding all of Chicago's policy. Even with development and definitely on a broader range of issues, I think the business interests, you know, do tend to get what they want in the long run, like the right to build these different mega projects we mentioned that did go through, you know, even after a lot of opposition. But I think it's worth noting when you're talking about, you know, who holds the power, just all the different levers of power and the fact that people like, or institutions like the teachers union or, you know, Father Flager, if you're getting a little broader, or Reverend Jesse Jackson, or, you know, there's all these people and groups that have a lot of power. The Obama Center, you know, all the ins and outs and debate around that are one example. Like there's and it doesn't just all come down to campaign donations either. You know, it's public pressure, media attention. There's a lot of powerful players from a big range of interests in Chicago. And depending on the issue, you know, it's really just a big melee often between these different interests. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's great about Chicago is there's not like a few puppet masters who are in power or anything.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Wujie. Other comments or questions?
I think one of the things about Chicago is that politics is the game. And that's where people find power. That's where they go to. You look at places like New York, they have we have a whole lot of other places to go to because we are a big industrial place. We are a global city. But I think politics is the one thing. And so sometimes we don't hear about somebody's name except in terms of politics. And I think that has something to do, it's our unique Chicago-ness.
Veronica, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I have a question. It's kind of similar to Wujie's, and it comes out of a comment that Mr. Stockwell said. And the comment was about the role of organizations and their influence. So the question is, what influence, if any, do organizations have in mayoral administrations and how the mayors make the decisions for the city? And I'm thinking in terms of Emanuel and Lightfoot administration. So last week we learned that Emanuel was more of an establishment mayor and that Lightfoot is more of a progressive mayor. So do the different mayoral administrations, how is the organizational influence, so like nonprofits, civil societies, does it differ for each administration or do they even have influence in the decisions? And I hope that made sense.
So Carrie, why don't we start with you? Is there any difference between the way organizations, civil organizations or community organizations or civic groups have an effect in the Emanuel administration versus the Lightfoot administration?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So Emmanuel, part of what really characterized him was right off the bat, he was pretty much unwilling and unwilling to listen to and dismissive of most of those civil sector community non-governmental organizations, and even compared to Mayor Daley, Mayor Daley, as much as he was establishment, was really savvy in working with community actors and organizations. So Rahm Emanuel did change a bit. He learned that you can't just totally ignore all those interests, that they're really crucial to having power in Chicago, and he did definitely have more interaction with those types of institutions or organizations in his second term, or during the lead up to his reelection. And then Lori Lightfoot was really notable. I'll leave most of talking about Lori Lightfoot to the experts on Lori Lightfoot, but it was really notable. Her transition team, and in the early days of her administration, and even during her campaign, how she very intentionally assembled a big all sorts of committees and was getting all kinds of advice very intentionally from the leading and often most progressive organizations across every issue. And I know, as we've talked about a little, a lot of those groups and members of them have been disappointed since in how that's played out. But I'm sure that the Lori Lightfoot experts have more to say about that.
Yeah, so just kind of a little bit of a bibliographical thread here. There's a book in the bibliography by Barbara Furman that talked about neighborhood politics, and also Larry Bennett's book on neighborhood politics in Uptown. When I think those organizations under the Harold Washington regime were much more influential, and Washington was much more friendly with them in terms of working together on neighborhood economic development issues. The Chicago Reporter, as I recall, my memory is kind of distant here, did some study of Richard M. Daley, and it seemed that Daley, he would help those agencies that supported him materially. But if he knew that those organizations were lining up against him, they would be punished financially and in other ways. So that was very different. The other thing in the Doring book that was mentioned, Yes for Them, that's a very interesting book because the civil society organizations there are in conflict with each other. And so they're trying to get the attention of the alderman, and the alderman is sort of taking sides there. But sometimes they are indeed in conflict with each other. But another little piece, the Center for Neighborhood Technology, because of its reputation, and it's one of my favorite groups in the city. They were approached by both Daley and Rahm Emanuel to help develop their sustainable city plans. And so they were kind of neutral politically, but they were really for greening the city, which made them more powerful. But I think that's a really good question that was raised, and I'm not sure I have the answer now. Maybe somebody else does, as to how, for example, immigration groups are able to organize and impact policy today. I think there's a lot of fracturing, and there's not as much access that those groups have as they maybe had in the past.
Just one caveat on the Harold Washington administration, with which I was intimately familiar as I was involved in his campaign and the transition team. Harold was all and needed the community organizations, and the community organizations did back Harold in the council wars. But Harold was in favor of, for instance, an example of that is he gave the money that had previously been used by the Machine administrations to hire patronage workers to deal with welfare programs like homelessness or economic development or whatever, or housing. He gave those now to community groups, churches and others, to actually do the same work that patronage workers used to do, which meant millions of dollars going to community groups in return, community groups were all for Harold as opposed to the 29 on the opposition. However, Harold did have his limits. He never understood neighborhood government. So while he was quite willing to work with community groups to be part of the community effort, he wasn't willing to set up an institutional structure where the neighborhoods could actually be part of the government or have a direct impact on the government. Just a side note to the history. Daniel.
Yeah, I wanted to also put in another, I wanted to also just put in another note on Harold Washington, which is that to a considerable extent, this network of neighborhood groups, Chicago Association of Neighborhood Development Organizations can do, Chicago Workshop on Economic Development, the Local Employment and Economic Development Council, or LEAD, who, when they realized that that was a bit confusing with building certification, renamed themselves North Branch Works. A lot of these groups fed a great many senior bureaucratic appointments in Washington's administrations. And I think that contributed a great deal to the relative longevity of Washington's politics, despite how short his administration was because of his death. So you see Donna Ducharme show up from North Branch Works in his administration. You see Bob Meyer from UIC show up as an administration. You see David Mosina, who lingered a long way into the Daley era. And I really do think this was a significant factor in helping to bake the Washington administration's policies a little bit more deeply than might have otherwise been the respect. I mean, maybe at the risk of sounding a little bit harsh here, I think it took Richie Daley the better part of a decade, through a combination of neglect, nepotism, and garden variety changes in policy, to clear all the Washington people out.
Did he?
We'll go to Rosaire. You're muted, Rosaire.
I just wanted to piggyback on what Carrie said, and I guess it ties into what you were saying, Professor Simpson, is that on Lightfoot and how she differs from Emanuel and involving community groups. There was a really interesting interview published about Lightfoot in the New York Times, and she kind of laid out her philosophy, or governing philosophy. And the thing of her, which I think has created so much tension in her administration, is that she does believe in listening to community groups. She's not like Emanuel, who really shut them off to begin with and really was very technocratic about it, only wanted a small pool of experts. So she does believe that. At the same time, she also really believes like the power of a strong mayor, and believes that she should be the one sort of guiding the ships and making the decision. So underlying, I feel like, a lot of her tensions in her administration is the question of how much power should be distributed in the city. It's kind of similar to Washington, where he brought a bunch of new people into office, but he doesn't necessarily attuned to the value of grassroots democracy. So that, I think, is another kind of tension that that sort of informs the history of Chicago's politics.
Eddie, I wonder if you could begin to take us home, as it were, and talk about the book project, not so much as what's in each of the chapters, but what is the attempt of the book, and what kind of ways does this reflect a new kind of scholarship, if it does? What kinds of themes are most important, and what kind of evidence was dug up in the process? It's an easy one.
Yeah, okay. I think everybody was pretty much addressing some of the same questions. How did somebody become mayor? Who were their factions supporting them? Where did their money come from? All those kinds of things. Also, what was their relationship with the city council? Was it a rubber stamp city council? Was it something that was more like what Lori Lightfoot sees, with a lot of coalitions or factions? or what have you. And how well did she work with it, or he work with it? I should probably say he, because most of them were men. All those kinds of things. And then what was their legacy? And when you look at the legacy, I think that you can see a combination of where their power came from, who they supported, and how things worked together. The other thing I keep seeing is that everybody fed off somebody that came before, even if they didn't agree with anything they did or said. They would use a lot of the stuff that they came up with. I think Richard J. Daley is a classic example of talking to neighborhoods after Harold Washington. His father didn't talk to neighborhoods, but Harold did, and he knew that was a very, very good idea. And then you go further on down the line, you see Lori Lightfoot having a lot of his Harold Washington's ideas, but these are the kinds of things. But throughout the book, you see the mayors finding their followers or finding their support, using it to get their agenda passed, and then maybe sometimes passing it on with legacy, but sometimes grabbing somebody's earlier legacy and using it in a completely different way than that person would have done.
So I'm going to pick up with Carrie, but I'm going to ask each of the authors, if they would, to reflect on what you may have learned in the process of doing. Some of us have written about this stuff for decades. Did we learn something new in doing the process? And in finishing up with Betty's point, is there something about legacy that we would want to say about the mayors? So Carrie, we'll start with you. You can do your comment that you were planning to do, and then sort of an overview of whether you've learned things in this process this time, and what do we, filling in for Betty, what does the book amount to from your perspective, from your particular chapter, and from whatever you've heard about the other chapters? So we'll start with Carrie and then Daniel and go back in the same order that people appeared. Carrie, you're muted.
Got it. I didn't have another comment, but I guess
Okay.
I'll give this a shot. I mean, there's just, Chicago is such an amazing place and such a wealth of knowledge among the authors of this book. I've learned so much and feel so lucky to be included in this. And I think I have really, among other things, learned and thought about the arc and, the way that all these different threads have continued through the different mayors, and how, there's sort of things buried below the surface. We might not think this was a characteristic of, we might not have realized that, I won't get into specific examples, but, there's sort of these continuities and also contradictions between the different mayors that aren't obvious in their, main public profiles, and that Chicago has had this very messy but interesting and hopefully overall forward moving, whatever that means, trajectory where, the weaknesses and the failures of the different mayors contribute to it maybe just as much as the successes. When Rahm Emanuel doesn't listen to people, that galvanizes movements and resistance, and lays the stage for Lori Lightfoot and the things she does right, that kind of pendulum. So anyway, I've learned a ton just about how Chicago is always this work in process, and any mayor is adding their own elements to it that have, and probably more of the city's trajectory is even shaped by the way the public responds to the mayors than the mayors themselves. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, again, likewise, thanks to all and anyone who is involved with including me in this project. I really greatly appreciate it. I think with Emmanuel, it's one thing that I'd not really previously been aware of is is how certain policy ideas were making it from the ranks to the upper administration. There's perhaps a little bit more pragmatism than I had anticipated, but I'd also not quite fully grasped just the depth of opposition in the Chicago business community to things like progressive taxation and so on. It's a big potential barrier to sorting the financial problems of this place out.
Rosaire?
I think the main lesson that I walk away is just trying to settle with the fact that Chicago is a city full of a lot of contradictions. For the Lightfoot chapter, she has these two coalition, and you would think that they would, be a lot of overlap historically with them, Chicago, and there is, but there's also a lot of divergence. A lot of people who are for good government are not necessarily attuned to the issues that of poverty and the progressives are concerned about. At the same time, a lot of people who are interested in redistributing wealth and dealing with neighborhoods and stuff like that, and Betty kind of alluded to this, they've cooperated with machine politics, and they never, sometimes the redistribution had a lot of corruption behind it. So it's just, I think it's trying to sort of sit and wrestle with those contradictions in Chicago's history.
Clinton?
Sorry. Well, I've got 3 comments. I think it was Saul Bellow that said that Chicago is a place where culture occasionally happens. And but I think what we're discovering and what the mayors are discovering is that there's cultures all over the place. It's a wonderfully beautiful, diverse city. But also Nelson Ogren says, if you love a city like Chicago, it's like loving a woman with a broken nose. Pardon the sexism, that's Nelson Ogren. And you have to love the alleys too. And you can't just love downtown. You have to be a mayor for the entire city. So that's from the fiction background. The other problem that I've learned a lot from Dick Simpson over the years is that there are books out there that talk about the limits of the city. What an incredible challenge. But the mayor does not have the money or the power to do all the stuff she wants to do. The crime, the disease, job creation, those are just huge tasks that any mayor has to have some really good relationships with Washington and with Springfield and with community organizations as well, if she or he is going to be successful. The third thing is that, and I'm not sure quite where to go with this, I think mayors have a choice to make, and that mayors have made their choices. Do you align with the big business elite and follow, what they would want to do with downtown Chicago, and maybe it's the next place where next gambling thing, if some of them would have their wish, perhaps, or do you connect again with those community organizations and those neighborhoods and around what their needs are? And I think mayors in Chicago have always had that question that has been really hard to answer.
Okay, so I think that probably is a good place to end. David Perry, who used to head Great Cities over in urban planning and at CUPA at UIC, used to be very much in favor of what might be called the big conversation or the continuing conversation. And in a way, the book is a conversation. We're not really just talking to each other as authors of the different chapters. We're talking to journalists and literary people like Saul Bellow and the previous historians who have studied the city, and then all the people who have in fact made the city. If we were talking directly with Rahm Emanuel or Richie Daley or Lori, we would, that conversation would would cover what it is that we've sort of said in the book, but they would have an answer. You know, their answer would undoubtedly be, I did the best I could with what I had or what it was possible. Politics is the art of the possible, not the art of the impossible. And so this is a continuing discussion. All of you are part of it. All of you will be contributing in the future to it, and not only in Chicago, but in Sao Paulo and everywhere around the world that you come from, because this is a very diverse class and group of people. So I think we can end it there. We'll thank our presenters tonight, not only for the chapters they've written in the book, for this conversation and discussion. Any of the students who need to take a few minutes and talk to me about their papers, you're welcome to stay on a couple of minutes or at least set another time. But I think we will sign off here. Thanks all of you for your participation.
Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, professors. Good night.
Okay.
So any of you?
Professor Simpson,
Yes.
go ahead, Elena.
Oh, no, I just wanted to set a time to talk about my paper. I'm not ready like now, but I would be probably late this week or early next week. So what time?
Let's do
Yeah.
early next week and wait 1 second while I get a calendar.
Sure.
I have time Tuesday morning if that works for you, Elena.
Tuesday morning works. Yes.
10 o'clock.
Yes.
Why don't you
Excellent.
join me here at this class Zoom site and I'll talk to
Of
you here.
course.
Okay.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Professor
Thank you.
Simpson.
Yes.
Hi, this is Yasmin speaking. I was just wondering if you could please quiz me into your schedule either by the end of this week or next week.
Let's put you also Tuesday morning if we could. We have, it turns out, on a lot of events this Friday, or I could do Thursday afternoon if that works for you.
Sure, let's do Thursday.
All right, 1 o'clock
You mean tomorrow or next Thursday?
this Thursday.
Oh, I won't be able to do this
Okay.
Thursday.
How about Tuesday morning after Elena?
Sure, that should do.
Let's plan 10:30. I doubt she'll take longer than that.
Sure, no worries.
Okay, Yasmin.
Thank you.
And Terry, you're joining us from the University of Chicago.
Hello, yes, I am, Professor.
So we're
Simpson.
delighted to have you. Terry Clark will be guiding, and if you're signed up for grade, you'll do it with Terry. And I will send you a copy of the research paper that's being done for the class, and you can work out with Terry if that's what you'll be doing for your grade.
Thank you so much, Professor Simpson.
Anything else that you need to get started with the class?
I think you sent me all of the recorded lectures and everything and the reading. So I think we're good for now. Thank you so much for having me in your class.
Oh, we're delighted and we look forward to your participation.
I also am with Terry right now, so I just watched the lecture with him. Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine, yes. No,
Okay,
you don't
great.
have to.
And I'm Sydney. Thank you so much for having me as well.
Oh, we're delighted to have, we're looking forward to your participation and maybe you bring a different perspective. Are you both sociologists?
I'm a public policy major.
And I'm an
Okay.
economics major.
Terrific. Okay, well, we have a number of other people in public administration and urban planning, education, as well as political science graduate students. So we've got quite a range.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Looking
much.
forward
All
to it.
right, glad you could be with us tonight. Yes, go ahead, Rodrigo. I'm going to just
Yes.